Imagine standing just a few meters away from a wounded bear. It sees me, I see it, and neither of us moves. I sat frozen, gripping the axe handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded, sweat forming at my temples. I had heard stories of bear attacks, seen the scars on old hunters who had lived to tell their tales. But I had never stood this close to one before. The bear wasn't charging. It wasn't growling. Hell, it wasn't even standing. It lay there, breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling like a struggling bellows. A deep gash ran along its front leg, darkened with dried blood. The wound was bad, real bad. I took an instinctive step back, my boots crunching against the underbrush. The bear's head jerked slightly at the noise, its deep-set eyes locking onto mine. There was no malice in them, no sign of the rage I had always been warned about. Just exhaustion, and maybe something else. I should leave, right now. Turning my back on a bear, even an injured one, went against every survival instinct I had. But staying? That was even worse. This was nature. The strong survived, the weak didn't. That's how it worked. And yet, something about this moment held me in place. My mind raced. I wasn't a vet. I wasn't some wildlife expert. What the hell could I do? And why the hell should I even try? I took another step back, then another. The bear didn't move. It only blinked slowly, its breathing heavy and labored. I turned and walked away, fast but controlled, making sure not to break into a sprint. That was the first rule, never run. My truck was parked about 100 yards up the path, just outside my cabin. I could leave, forget I even saw it. But the second I stepped onto my porch, something gnawed at me. I had seen wounded animals before. Deer that had been clipped by a car, a fox limping from an old trap injury. But this was different. The sheer size of the bear should have been enough to convince me that it was just another predator, one of many in the woods. Yet that look, something about that look had unsettled me. I stared at the axe in my hand. I had gripped it out of fear, out of instinct. But what would I have done with it? If the bear had lunged, would I have fought back? Killed it? I set the axe down against the porch railing, exhaling sharply. My gut told me to forget it, go inside, crack open a beer, and watch the evening slip away. My gut also told me that bear wasn't making it through the night. Against every rational thought, against everything I had ever known about survival, I turned back toward the woods. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know why I was doing it, but for some reason I couldn't just walk away. I grabbed an old cooler from beside the cabin, filled it with some leftover meat from the freezer, and slung it under my arm. My steps back toward the bear were slower, heavier. The weight of my own decision pressed down on me. What was I thinking? I wasn't some animal rescuer. I wasn't here to play hero. I had lived in these woods for over a decade, and I knew better than to get involved in something like this. Yet here I was. When I stepped back into the clearing, the bear was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. Its ears twitched as I approached, but it didn't lift its head. I hesitated, then set the cooler down several feet away. I flipped it open and pulled out a slab of meat, tossing it carefully onto the grass. The bear didn't react at first. It just lay there, breathing, eyes half-lidded. Then, after what felt like forever, it shifted slightly, its nose twitching. I held my breath. Slowly, painfully, the bear stretched its neck forward and sniffed at the meat. It took another moment, then weakly pulled it toward its mouth. I didn't wait to see more. I stepped back, turned, and walked away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what I had just started, but something told me it wasn't over yet. The next morning, I woke up restless. I didn't know why, but I had this gnawing feeling in my gut, like something was unfinished. The bear. The damn bear. I stepped onto the porch, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My first instinct was to grab my coffee, sit down, and forget about it. But instead, I found myself walking toward the woods, boots crunching against the damp earth. When I reached the spot, my heart pounded. The meat was gone. There were no scraps left, no sign of struggle, no blood. Either something else had taken it or the bear had managed to eat. I scanned the trees, expecting to see a massive shadow looming in the distance, but the clearing was empty. Maybe it had crawled deeper into the forest. Maybe it had died in the night. I should have walked away. That would have been the smart thing to do. But instead, I turned back to the cabin, grabbed another slab of meat from the freezer, and returned to the same spot. This time, I didn't just drop it and leave. I sat down on a nearby fallen log, a good distance away, and waited. First, there was nothing. Just the wind through the branches, the distant chatter of birds. The longer I sat there, the more ridiculous I felt. I wasn't a dam ranger. I wasn't some animal whisperer. This was a bear, a wild animal that could rip me apart without a second thought. And yet, something inside me refused to let it go. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I shifted my weight, thinking about leaving, when I heard it. A low, dragging sound. I turned my head slowly, my breath hitching. From the edge of the clearing, the bear emerged, moving with slow, painful steps. It was barely supporting its weight, its injured leg trembling with every motion. It stopped, sniffing the air. It had caught the scent. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The bear dragged itself closer, stopping a few feet from the meat. It hesitated, then, with a weak groan, lowered itself and began to eat. I watched in silence, my heart hammering. Up close, the damage was worse than I had thought. The wound on its leg was deep, crusted with dried blood and dirt. Infection would set in soon if it hadn't already. For the first time in my life, I pitted a bear. It chewed slowly, every motion deliberate. I could see the exhaustion in its body, the sheer willpower it took just to keep itself upright. Then suddenly it stopped. Its eyes flicked up, locking onto mine. I didn't move. I wanted to run. But I knew better. The bear stared at me for what felt like an eternity. My fingers twitched, ready to push myself up and bolt if I had to. Then, just as suddenly, it returned to eating. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. When it finished, it let out a deep exhale, almost like a sigh, then shifted its massive body to a more comfortable position. For a second, I thought it might try to stand, but it just lay there, breathing. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I just sat there watching as the beast, this predator I had feared my whole life, closed its eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep. And for some reason, I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt responsible. The next morning, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. The weight of what I had done, what I had started, pressed against my chest. I didn't want to check on the bear, but I had to. When I reached the clearing, I found it exactly where I had left it, sprawled on its side, barely moving. A pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. The meat hadn't been enough. The damn thing was dying. I stood there, arms crossed, debating. This wasn't my problem. I had done more than most would. Nature had its rules. Survival of the fittest and all that. And yet, I didn't turn away. I took a cautious step forward. Then another. The closer I got, the more I saw just how bad it was. The wound was ugly, jagged, deep, with angry red flesh peeking through dried blood. Infection had already set in. I let out a slow breath. If I didn't do something, this bear wasn't going to last another night. What the hell was I supposed to do? This wasn't a stray dog I could take to a vet. I squatted down a few feet away, trying to think. The bear's breathing was shallow, its sides barely rising. It hadn't moved since I arrived. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe I could. A shift. A slow, deliberate one. The bear's head lifted just an inch. Its eyes cracked open, and they landed right on me. I went completely still. My body tensed, instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I didn't move. The bear didn't growl, didn't make a sound. It just looked at me. I had expected wild, primal rage, or fear, something. But there was none of that. Only exhaustion, pain. Something in my chest tightened. Carefully, I reached for my belt, pulling out the small hunting knife I always carried. I wasn't sure what I was doing. Wasn't sure I'd even get close enough to do anything. But I had to try. I scooted forward inch by inch, my pulse hammering. The bear didn't move. When I was close enough to see the heat radiating from its massive body, I hesitated. "All right," I murmured. "Let's not make this the dumbest thing I've ever done." The bear's ear twitched, but it didn't snap at me, didn't lunge. I swallowed hard and reached out. Slowly, carefully, my fingers hovered over its matted fur, just inches from the wound. The heat from the infection pulsed against my skin. I needed to clean it. Shit, I had to go back to the cabin, get supplies, but leaving meant coming back. And coming back meant accepting that I was really doing this. My stomach twisted. I stood up, taking a slow step back. The bear's eyes followed me. I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. But for the first time since this started, I knew I'd be coming back. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. I had no idea what I was doing, no plan, no guarantees. But that damn bear, its eyes, the slow rise and fall of its chest, had burned itself into my head. I couldn't just let it rot out there. I threw open the cabinet doors, searching for anything that might help. Rubbing alcohol, a few clean rags, an old first aid kit I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When I stepped back into the woods, I half expected the bear to be gone. Maybe instinct had finally kicked in, and it had dragged itself deeper into the forest to die. But it was still there, exactly where I had left it. I approached cautiously, my pulse hammering. The supplies felt heavy in my hands. This was insane. This was suicide. The bear's head shifted slightly as I knelt a few feet away. Its eyes flicked toward me. Yeah, I muttered. "I don't like this either." I soaked a rag in alcohol and hesitated. How the hell was I supposed to clean a wound on a bear? The second this stuff touched raw flesh, it was gonna hurt like hell. And if it lashed out, I swallowed hard and reached forward. The rag pressed against the wound. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated through the bear's chest. His muscles tensed, claws flexing against the dirt. I jerked back, ready to run, but it didn't move beyond that, just growled slow and low. A warning. I know, I muttered. "It stings. Suck it up." I pressed again, wiping away dirt and dried blood. The growl faded, though the bear's breathing stayed rough and uneven. For the next few days, I repeated the process. Bring food, clean the wound, keep my distance. Little by little, the bear improved. It ate more, moved more. Its eyes grew sharper. Then, one morning, everything changed. I had just dropped a slab of meat onto the grass when I noticed it. Something different in the way the bear shifted. More control, less struggle. And then, for the first time in days, it moved. Not a slow drag, not a feeble shift. Pushed itself up, weight shifting onto its good legs. I froze. The bear wobbled, muscle straining, but it stood. I realized, with a sick twist in my gut, that I had let myself get too comfortable. I had been feeding an animal, a predator, and now it was getting stronger. The bear turned its head toward me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The weight of every bad decision I had made pressed down on me. Then it took a step forward. Just one. Enough to close the gap between us by inches. Enough to remind me what it really was. I took a step back, my fingers twitching toward the knife at my belt. The bear tilted its head slightly. Then it huffed, a slow exhale, and lowered itself back down, settling onto its stomach. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't ready to walk away yet, and somehow neither was I. Days passed. The bear was getting stronger, moving with more control, eating with more intent. And somewhere along the way, my fear started to fade. Not completely. That would be stupid. But I wasn't looking at it like a monster anymore. It was just a living thing, a wounded animal trying to survive. And I had helped it. That thought did something to me. I had never been the kind of man to take care of anything. Not a pet, not a person. I liked my space, my quiet. But now, every morning, I woke up thinking about that damn bear. It was a dangerous thing, getting comfortable, and I was about to learn that the hard way. One afternoon, I brought food as usual. The bear was sitting up now, its head held high, watching me as I approached. It wasn't struggling anymore. It wasn't weak. It was aware. I set the meat down a few feet away the way I always did. But instead of backing off, I hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something even dumber than that. But I found myself reaching out. Not much, just a small, cautious movement. Fingers extending. A gesture that any reasonable person would know was a mistake. For a second, nothing happened. Then the bear moved. Fast. Faster than I had ever seen it move before. A blur of muscle and fur. A sharp exhale like a warning shot. I didn't even have time to think. My body reacted before my brain could. Stumbling backward, hands up in some useless attempt to shield myself. The bear didn't lunge, didn't attack, but its reaction had been instant, pure instinct. And for the first time in days, I remembered exactly what I was dealing with. I wasn't feeding a friend. I was feeding a predator, a creature built for hunting, for killing. And I had just triggered something deep in its nature. My heart pounded as I held my ground, forcing myself to stay still, to not make things worse. The bear was watching me again, but it was different now. Sharper, calculating. I swallowed hard. "All right," I muttered. Message received. Slowly, carefully, I stepped back, putting space between us. My pulse hammered in my ears, my legs tense, ready to run if I had to. The bear didn't follow, didn't move at all. It just sat there, breathing, staring. And then, after what felt like forever, it lowered its head and went back to eating. I let out a shaky breath. That was it. The line had been drawn. I had gotten too close, too comfortable. And the bear had reminded me in no uncertain terms of what it really was. I turned and walked away, my hands still trembling. Lesson learned. The next morning, I woke up with a weight in my chest. Something wasn't sitting right. Maybe it was the way the bear had reacted yesterday. Maybe it was the way I had let my guard down. Either way, I knew one thing: I had gotten too comfortable. And that was dangerous. Still, like a fool, I went back. When I reached the clearing, the bear was already awake, standing near the spot where I usually left food. Its posture was different, more upright, more alert. It wasn't the wounded animal I had first found. It was something else now, something more dangerous. I hesitated. A smart man would have taken the hint, walked away, left nature to its course. But I wasn't a smart man. I took a step forward. The bear turned its head sharply, locking onto me. A flash of something primal flickered in its eyes, something I hadn't seen before. I wasn't just a presence in its world anymore. I was something it was measuring, evaluating. For the first time in days, I felt small. I set the meat down carefully, trying to act normal, but my movements were stiffer, more deliberate. I kept my eyes on the bear, watching for any shift, any sign that I had pushed too far. And then I made the worst mistake of my life. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some leftover sense of control. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that yesterday was a fluke, that I hadn't lost my grip on this situation. But as I turned to walk away, I hesitated. And then I looked back. Our eyes met. In that split second, I saw the shift, the moment the fragile balance between us snapped. The bear's ears flattened. His muscles coiled. His breathing deepened. A growl, low and guttural, rolled from its chest. Everything in my body screamed at me to move, to run. But I knew better. Running meant death. So I stood there, frozen, every inch of me locked in place. The bear took a step forward, then another. I could feel its breath now, hot and sharp in the cold air. My hand twitched toward the knife at my belt. Not that it would do much. Not against something this big, this fast. Another growl. Louder. Closer. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The bear exhaled sharply and shifted its weight back, its eyes still locked on me. It was waiting, testing, seeing what I would do next. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the bear turned. It didn't run, didn't retreat, just walked away. I let out a slow, shaking breath, my legs barely holding me up. I had made a mistake, a fatal one. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I stayed there for a long time, my heart still slamming in my chest. The forest around me seemed different now, heavier, more alive with tension. I had been stupid, reckless. The bear was no longer a helpless creature. It had regained its strength, and it had just reminded me what it was. A hunter, a survivor, and I was nothing more than a fool who had pushed too far. I forced myself to move, step by step, until I was far enough from the clearing to breathe again. My body ached from the tension, my fingers numb from clenching the knife at my belt. I had been close, too damn close. Back at the cabin, I paced the floor, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my gut. The bear had let me walk away today, but that didn't mean it would next time. I wasn't part of its world. I wasn't its friend. I was a fool who had tried to control something untamed. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, rubbing a hand over my face. I needed to stop. This had to end. No more food. No more visits. No more tempting fate. I told myself that over and over again. And yet, when the sun began to set, I found myself looking toward the woods, wondering if the bear was still there, waiting. The day after the bear's warning, I stayed inside. I told myself it was over. I had pushed too far, made mistakes, nearly gotten myself killed. There would be no next time, no more food, no more visits. And yet, as the day stretched on, I found myself pacing by the window, glancing toward the woods more times than I cared to admit. I told myself it was just habit, that I was only making sure the bear wasn't lurking nearby, waiting to finish what it had started. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was waiting for it. By late afternoon, my nerves were shot. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Nothing. A hollow feeling settled in my chest. Maybe it really was over. Then, just as I was about to turn back inside, I saw it, the bear. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, watching me. Not moving, not growling, just watching. A shiver crawled up my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to go back inside, to break this cycle before it was too late. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. Slowly, the bear stepped forward. Not aggressive, not cautious, just deliberate. I stiffened. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was this it? Had it finally decided what I was to it? Prey, threat, nothing at all? Took another step, then another. My pulse pounded, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then, just a few feet away, it stopped. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the same way we had on that first day. But this time, something was different. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my gut. The bear wasn't the same animal I had fed for the past week. It wasn't the weak, wounded creature I had pitted. It wasn't even the predator that had nearly tested its strength against me. It was something else entirely, and that terrified me more than anything. The bear exhaled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air between us. It held my gaze for another second. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it turned. Not in fear, not in retreat, just leaving. I watched as it disappeared into the trees, its massive form blending into the forest like it had never been there at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something was wrong. Not in the way I had expected. Not in the way that sent adrenaline rushing through my veins, but in a way that sat deep in my bones, an unease I couldn't shake. The bear was gone, and yet, somehow I knew this wasn't the end. Not even close. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, expecting to see a familiar dark shape lingering at the edge of the woods. But the clearing was empty. No bear, no tracks, just silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than noise, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I told myself this was a good thing. The bear had moved on. Nature had taken its course. I had done what I could, and now it was over. That was the logical way to see it. But as the days passed, an unfamiliar emptiness settled in my chest. For the past week, I had woken up every morning with a purpose. Bringing food, checking on it, watching for signs of improvement. It had become part of my routine, part of my life. And now, without it, something felt off. I tried to ignore it, threw myself into work, chopped more wood than I needed, fixed things that weren't broken, took longer walks, as if putting distance between myself and the clearing would erase what had happened. But it didn't. Days turned into weeks. A month passed. I got back to my usual routine. The world moved on, and so did I, or at least that's what I told myself. But some nights, when the wind shifted just right, I'd catch myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see a pair of dark eyes staring back at me. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, I heard it. A heavy thud, then another, slow, deliberate, footsteps. I froze. My body tensed before my mind could catch up. I knew that sound, the weight of it, the rhythm. Not a deer, not a person. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned toward the tree line. The shadows stretched long in the fading light, but I didn't need to see clearly to know. It was him. The bear stood just beyond the clearing, watching me. A part of me expected fear to kick in, the same gut-wrenching panic I had felt in the beginning. But it didn't come. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the way we always had. Then, slowly, the bear took a step forward. Not aggressive, not hesitant, just there. I swallowed, my fingers gripping the porch railing. My heart pounded, but not from fear. It was something else, something I couldn't name. The bear exhaled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air between us. It held my gaze for another second. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it turned. Not in fear, not in retreat, just leaving. I watched as it disappeared into the trees, its massive form blending into the forest like it had never been there at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something about this moment felt different, final, like the last page of a story I hadn't meant to write. The bear was gone, and yet, somehow I knew this wasn't really the end. Not in the way that mattered. I stayed on the porch long after the bear had vanished, the air cool against my skin, the sounds of the forest creeping back in around me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like something was missing. I just smiled.